Hey, this is The Birth of the Clinic by Michel Foucault, Chapter 3, entitled The Free Field. The contrast between a medicine of pathological spaces and a medicine of the social space was concealed from contemporaries by the visible prestige accorded to a consequence common to both: the removal from the field of all medical institutions that proved unyielding towards the new requirements of the gaze. In fact, an entirely free field of medical experiment had to be constituted so that the natural seeds of the species might emerge unblurred and without trace. It also had to be sufficiently present in its totality and concentrated in its content to allow the formation of an accurate, exhaustive, permanent corpus of knowledge about the health of a population. This medical field, restored to its pristine truth, pervaded wholly by the gaze, without obstacle and without alteration, is strangely similar in its implicit geometry to the social space dreamt of by the revolution, at least in its original conception. A form homogeneous in each of its regions, constituting a set of equivalent items capable of maintaining constant relations with their entirety, a space of free communication in which the relationship of the parts to the whole was always transposable and reversible. There is, therefore, a spontaneous and deeply rooted convergence between the requirements of political ideology and those of medical technology. In a concerted effort, doctors and statesmen demand, in a different vocabulary but for essentially identical reasons, the suppression of every obstacle to the constitution of this new space. The hospitals, which alter the specific laws governing disease and which disturb those no less rigorous laws that define the relations between property and wealth, poverty and work, the association of doctors, which prevents the formation of a centralized medical consciousness, and the free play of an experience that is allowed to reach the universal without imposed limitations. And lastly, the faculties, which recognize that which is true only in theoretical structures, and turn knowledge into a social privilege. Liberty is the vital, unfettered force of truth. It must, therefore, have a world in which the gaze, free of all obstacle, is no longer subjected to the immediate law of truth. The gaze is not faithful to truth, nor subject to it, without asserting at the same time a supreme mastery. The gaze that sees is a gaze that dominates, and although it also knows how to subject itself, it dominates its masters. Despotism has need of darkness, but liberty, radiant with glory, can only survive when surrounded by all the light that can enlighten men. It is during the sleep of peoples that tyranny can establish itself and become naturalized among them. Make other nations tributaries not of your political authority, nor of your government, but of your talents and your knowledge. There is a dictatorship for peoples whose yoke is not repugnant to those who bend under it, and that is the dictatorship of genius. The ideological theme that guides all structural reforms from 1789 to Thermidor year number 2 is that of the sovereign liberty of truth, the majestic violence of light, which is in itself supreme, brings to an end the bounded dark kingdom of privileged knowledge and establishes the unimpeded empire of the gaze. Roman numeral 1, the investment in hospital structures. The Comité de Mendicité de l'Assemblée Nationale was under the influence of both economists and doctors who believed that the only possible locus for recovering from disease was the natural environment of social life, the family. There, the cost of sickness to the nation was reduced to a minimum, and the risk of the disease leading to artificial complications spreading of its own accord and assuming, as in hospitals, the aberrant form of a disease of the disease was avoided. In the family, the disease was in a state of nature, that is, in accord with its own nature and freely exposed to the regenerative forces of nature. The gaze that is turned upon it by those close to the sick person has the vital force of benevolence and the discretion of hope. In the freely observed disease, there is something that compensates for it. Misfortune arouses by its presence beneficent compassion, brings to birth in men's hearts the pressing need to offer comfort and consolation. and the care given to the unfortunate in their own dwellings turns to account that abundant spring of wealth distributed by private benevolence. If the poor man is put into a hospital, he is deprived of all these resources. No doubt, there are sick persons who have no family, and others who are so poor that they live cooped up in attics. For these, communal houses for the sick must be set up that would function as family substitutes and spread, in the form of reciprocity, the gaze of compassion. In this way, the poor would find in companions of their own kind naturally sympathetic creatures who are at least not entirely strangers to them. Thus, disease would everywhere find its natural, or almost natural, locale, where it would be free to follow its own course and to abolish itself in its truth. But the ideas of the Comité de Mendicité are also related to the theme of a social, centralized consciousness of disease. A generalized state of health is not to be expected solely from such a freedom. If the family was bound to the unfortunate individual by the natural duty of compassion, the nation was bound to him by the social, collective duty to provide assistance. Hospital foundations represented by an immobilization of wealth, and by their very inertia, created poverty. These must disappear, but they must be replaced by a national, constantly available fund capable of providing help when and where required. The state must, therefore, divert to its own use the wealth of the hospitals and then combine it into a common fund. A central body would be set up to administer this fund. It would act as the permanent medico-economic conscience of the nation. It would be the universal perception of every illness and the immediate recognition of all needs. The great oeil de la misère, it would be given the task of distributing sums necessary and completely adequate for the alleviation of the unfortunate. It would finance the communal house and provide special help to poor families who care for their sick themselves. The project failed on account of two technical problems. The first, that of the diversion of hospital funds, is political and economic in nature. The second is medical in nature and concerns complex or contagious diseases. The Legislative Assembly went back on the principle of the nationalization of hospital capital. It preferred simply to divert its revenue into an assistance fund. It also decided not to entrust the administration of the fund to a central body, which it was believed would be so cumbersome, too distant, and therefore unable to respond to immediate needs. If the consciousness of disease and poverty was to be immediate and effective, it should be a geographically specific consciousness. And in this field, as in so many others, the Legislative Assembly went back on the centralization of the Constituent Assembly and adopted a much looser, anglicized system. Local authorities would make the essential links, keep themselves informed of needs, and distribute the revenues. They would form a multiple network of supervision. Thus, the principle of the communalization of assistance was raised, a principle to which the Directoire finally rallied. But in this dispersed structure, decentralization is associated with two historically important themes of assistance and of repression. Tinon, in his concern to settle the question of Bistre and Salpêtrière, wanted the legislature to create a comité for hospitals and houses of arrest, maison d'arrestation, that would be generally responsible for hospitals, prisons, vagabondage, and epidemics. The Assembly opposed the suggestion on the ground that, in a sense, it debases the lower classes of the people by entrusting the care of the unfortunate and of criminals to these same persons. The consciousness of disease and of the assistance that it required among the poor assumed autonomy. It was now concerned with a very specific type of poverty. Similarly, the doctor began to play a decisive role in the organization of assistance. At the social level at which help was distributed, it was the doctor who discovered where it was needed and judged the nature and degree of the assistance to be given. The decentralization of the means of assistance authorized a medicalization of its distribution. This is reminiscent of an idea made familiar by Cabanis, that of the doctor-magistrate, to whom men's lives would be entrusted by the community, instead of leaving them to the mercy of mountebanks and gossips. He would act according to the belief that the lives of the rich and powerful are no more precious than those of the poor and weak. Lastly, he would be able to refuse help to public malefactors. In addition to his role as a technician of medicine, he would play an economic role in the distribution of help and a moral, quasi-judicial role in its attribution. He would become the guardian of public morals and public health alike. In this regional configuration, in which the medical consciousness is made up of discontinuous authorities, the hospital must have a place. It is needed for the sick who have no family, but it is also needed in cases of contagion and for difficult, complex, extraordinary patients with whom medicine in its ordinary everyday form cannot cope. Again, one who can detect the influence of Tinon and Cabanis, the hospital, which in its general form was associated only with penury, appears at the local level as an indispensable measure of protection. Protection of the healthy against the disease. Protection of the sick against the nostrums of the ignorant. The people must be saved from its own errors. Protection of the sick from one another. What Tinon is proposing is a differentiated hospital space, and differentiated according to two principles. Training, by which each hospital would devote itself to the care of a particular category of patient or family of diseases, and distribution, which within a single hospital would determine the order in which the different kinds of patient would be arranged with a view to admission. Thus, the family, the natural locus of disease, is duplicated by another space that must reproduce, like a microcosm, the specific configuration of the pathological world. There, beneath the eye of the hospital doctor, diseases would be grouped into orders, genera, and species in a rationalized domain that would restore the original distribution of essences. Thus conceived, the hospital would make it possible to classify patients to such a point that each would find what was suited to his state without aggravating by his proximity the illness of others, and without spreading contagion either in the hospital or outside it. In the hospital, disease meets, as it were, the forced residence of its truth. In the projects of the Comité des Secours, two authorities are juxtaposed. The ordinary, which, because of the distribution of aid, involves a continuous supervision of the social space with a system of highly medicalized regional centers, and the extraordinary, which is made up of discontinuous, exclusively medical spaces, structured according to the model of scientific knowledge. Disease is thus caught in a double system of observation. There is a gaze that does not distinguish it from, but reabsorbs it into, all the other social ills to be eliminated, and a gaze that isolates it with a view to circumscribing its natural truth. The Legislative Assembly left to the Convention two problems that were not resolved: that of the ownership of hospital funds and the new problem of the staffing of hospitals. On 18 August 1792, the Assembly had declared the dissolution of all religious corporations and secular congregations of men or women, ecclesiastical or lay, but most of the hospitals were run by religious orders, or like La Salpêtrière, by the lay organizations conceived on a quasi-monastic model. So the decree added, nevertheless, in hospitals and houses of charity, the same persons will continue as before to serve the poor and care for the sick in an individual capacity under the supervision of the municipal and administrative bodies until their definitive organization is presented to the National Assembly by the Comité des Secours. In fact, right up to the fall of Robespierre, the convention was to consider the problem of assistance in the hospitals, above all in terms of abolition. The immediate abolition of state help demanded by the Girondists, who feared the political adhesion of the poorest classes to the communes, if the latter were given the task of distributing assistance. For Roland, the system of handouts was the most dangerous one. No doubt, beneficence can and must be carried out by private subscription, but the government must not interfere and would be misled and would give little or no help. The abolition of the hospitals was demanded by the Mountain, the extremist party, who regarded them as an institutionalization of poverty and who believed that one of the tasks of the revolution must be to make them unnecessary. Speaking of a hospital devoted to suffering humanity, Le Bon asked, "Must any section of mankind be sick and needy? Therefore, let notices be placed over the gates of these asylums, announcing their coming disappearance. For if the revolution is complete, we still have such unfortunates among us, our revolutionary work will have been in vain." And Barrère, in the debate of the law of 22 Floréal, April to May, year number 2, was to launch the famous cry, "No more alms, no more hospitals." With the victory of the Mountain, the idea of an organization of public assistance by the state and of a complementary abolition of the hospitals over a fairly long period of time was accepted. The Constitution of Year 2 proclaims in its Declaration of Rights that public assistance is a sacred debt. The law of 22 Floréal ordered the drawing up of a great book of national beneficence and the organization of a system of help throughout the countryside. Provision was made for houses of health, only for the sick who have no home or who cannot receive help there. The nationalization of hospital funds, which had been accepted in principle since March 1793, but the application of which was to be postponed until after a complete definitive organization in several areas of public help was put into immediate execution with the law of 23 Messidor, June through July, year number 2. The hospital funds would be regarded as national property, and assistance would be the responsibility of the Treasury. Cantonal agencies would be entrusted with the task of distributing the help needed by each household. Thus, in legislation, if not in reality, the great dream of a total dehospitalization of disease and poverty began to be brought about. Poverty is an economic fact for which assistance must be given while it exists. Disease is an individual accident that the family must respond to by ensuring that the victim has the necessary care. The hospital is an anachronistic solution that does not respond to the real needs of the poor and that stigmatizes the sick in a state of penury. There must be an ideal state in which the human being would no longer know exhaustion from hard labor or the hospital that leads to death. A man is made neither for a trade, nor for a hospital, nor for a poorhouse. Such a prospect is too terrible. Okay, Roman numeral 2, the law of medical practice and teaching. The decrees of Marley, issued in March 1707, regulated the practice of medicine and the training of doctors for the rest of the 18th century. It was then a matter of struggling against charlatans, quacks, and unqualified and incapable persons practicing medicine. Similarly, there had been a need to reorganize the medical faculties, which for many years had fallen into the most extreme slackness. It was laid down that henceforth medicine would be taught in all the universities of the kingdom that had or had had a faculty, that the chairs, instead of remaining vacant for an indefinite period, would be made available as soon as they became free, that the students would receive their degree only after 3 years of study, duly verified by matriculation every 4 months, that every year they would have to pass an examination before receiving the title of bachelor, licentié, or doctor, that they would follow compulsory courses in anatomy, in chemical and galenic pharmacy, and in demonstrations of plants. In these conditions, Article 26 of the decree enunciated the principle that no person may practice medicine or prescribe any remedy, even without payment, if he has not obtained the degree of licentié. And the text added, and this was the fundamental issue and aim achieved by the faculties of medicine at the cost of their reorganization, and all religious mendicant or non-mendicant shall be and remain included in the prohibition laid down in the preceding article. By the end of the century, the critics were unanimous on at least 4 points. Charlatans continued to flourish. The canonical teachings provided by the faculties no longer satisfied either the needs of medical practice nor new discoveries. Only theory was taught. Neither mathematics nor physics was considered. There were too many schools of medicine for teaching to be carried out in a satisfactory manner. Peculation was rife. The chairs were obtained like any other post. The professors charged for their lectures. The students bought their examinations and got needy doctors to write these theses for them, which made medical studies extremely costly. A situation made worse by the fact that, when qualified, the new doctor still had to gain practical experience by accompanying some well-known practitioner on his visits, for which privilege he began had to pay. The revolution was faced, therefore, with 2 demands: a stricter limitation on the right to practice and a stricter organization of the university cursus. But both went against the whole movement of reforms that culminated in the abolition of guilds and the master-apprentice system, and in the closing of the universities. There was thus a certain amount of tension between the requirements of a reorganization of knowledge, those of the abolition of privileges, and those of an effective supervision of the nation's health. How can the free gaze that medicine, and through it, the government, must turn upon the citizens, be equipped and competent, without being embroiled in the esotericism of knowledge and the rigidity of social privilege? First problem: can medicine be a free profession that is protected by no corporative law, no prohibition of practice, no privilege of qualification? Can the medical consciousness of a nation be as spontaneous as its civic or moral consciousness? Doctors defend their corporate rights on the ground that they should be understood, not in the sense of privilege, but of collaboration. The medical body is to be distinguished from political bodies in that it does not seek to limit the liberty of others or to impose laws and obligations upon the citizens. Its imperative applies only to itself. Its jurisdiction is concentrated within itself. But it is also to be distinguished from other professional bodies because it is intended not to preserve rights and obscure traditions, but to confront and to communicate knowledge. Without an established organ, enlightenment would be extinguished at birth and individual experience lost for all. In forming themselves into a body, doctors make the following implicit oath: we wish to enlighten our minds by fortifying ourselves with our collective knowledge. The weakness of some of our number is corrected by the superiority of others. By coming together under a common administration, we will continue to arouse competition among ourselves. The medical body criticizes itself to a greater extent than it protects itself. And by virtue of this fact, it is indispensable in protecting the people from its own illusions and from the mystifications of charlatans. If physicians and surgeons form a necessary body in society, their important functions require, on the part of the legislative authority, special consideration in the prevention of abuses. A free state that wishes to maintain its citizens free from error and from the ills that it entails cannot authorize the free practice of medicine. In fact, no one, not even the most liberal of the Girondists, dreamt of freeing medical practice entirely and opening it up to a free regime of uncontrolled competition. While demanding the abolition of all constituted medical bodies, even Mathieu Guéroud wished to set up in each department a court that would try any private person dabbling in medicine without having given proof of his skill. But the problem of the practice of medicine was linked to three other problems: the general abolition of guilds, the disappearance of the Society of Medicine, and, above all, the closing of the universities. Up to Thermidor, there were innumerable projects for the reorganization of the schools of medicine. They fall into two groups. The first presupposing the survival of university structures, and the second taking into account the decrees of 17 August 1792. Among the reformists, one constantly encounters the idea that local interests must be abolished, together with the smaller moribund faculties, in which an inadequate number of professors, all incompetent, distribute or sell degrees and other qualifications. A small number of faculties would offer chairs throughout the country that would be filled by the best candidates. They would train doctors whose quality would be undisputed. The double check of the state and public opinion would thus favor the development of a body of medical knowledge and a medical consciousness that would last be adequate to the nation's needs. Theory thought that 4 faculties would be enough. Gallet preferred 2, with a number of special schools for a less advanced course of training. Moreover, the duration of studies would have to be longer, 7 years according to Gallet, 10 according to Canton. This was because it was now intended to include in the curriculum mathematics, geometry, physics, and chemistry, all of which had an organic connection with medical science. But above all, there had to be practical training. Theory wanted a Royal Institute, which would provide the pick of the young doctors with a more advanced, essentially practical training. A sort of residential school would be set up in the Jardin du Roi that would operate in close cooperation with a hospital, La Salpêtrière, which was nearby, would serve the purpose. There, the professors would teach as they visited the patients. The faculté would merely appoint a doctor regent for the public examinations of the institute. Canton suggested that once the rudiments had been taught, the candidate doctors would be sent either to a hospital or to the countryside, where they would attain practical experience as assistants to already qualified doctors. For very often what is needed is an extra pair of hands, and patients rarely need highly qualified doctors. By making a kind of medical tour of France, the future doctors would acquire the most varied experience, learn to recognize the diseases peculiar to each climate, and learn what methods were most successful in the treatment of each illness. A practical training curiously independent of the theoretical teaching provided by the university was proposed, whereas, as we shall see later, medicine already possessed concepts that enabled it to define the unity of clinical teaching. The theoreticians failed to propose an institutional version of it. Practical training was not simply the application of abstract knowledge. If so, it would be enough to entrust this practical teaching to the professors in the schools, nor could it be the key to this knowledge, which could be acquired only when this knowledge had been mastered. Because, in fact, this practical teaching still concealed the technological structure of a medicine of the social group, whereas the university training was inseparable from a medicine that was so closely related to the theory of species. In a rather paradoxical way, this acquisition of practical training, which is dominated by the theme of social usefulness, was left almost entirely to private initiative, with the state controlling little more than the theoretical teaching. Cabanis wanted every hospital doctor to be allowed to form a school according to whatever plan he considered most suitable. He and he alone would decide the duration of each student's studies. For some, 2 years would be enough. Other, less gifted students would require 4 years. As the result of individual initiative, these lessons would have to be paid for by the students, and the professors themselves would determine the fees. These might be very high in the case of a famous professor whose teaching was much in demand, but this would be no bad thing. A spirit of noble emulation, sustained by all manner of motives, cannot but be to the advantage of patients, students, and science. This reformist thinking has a curious and complex structure. Assistance was to be left to individual initiative, and the hospital establishments were to be maintained for a complex, almost privileged medicine. By a kind of exchange of places, the position of teaching was inverted. It followed an obligatory public course to the university to become, at the hospital stage, private, competitive, and fee-paying. Okay, so it followed an obligatory public course to the university to become, at the hospital stage, private, competitive, and fee-paying. This was because, at this level, the technological structures of knowledge and that of perception were not yet capable of being superimposed. The way in which one directed one's gaze and the way in which it was trained did not overlap. The field of practical medicine was divided between a free, endlessly open domain, that of home practice, and a closed space, confined to the truths of the species that it revealed. The field of apprenticeship was divided between an enclosed domain of essential truths and a free domain in which truth speaks of itself. And the hospital played this dual role. For the doctor's gaze, it was the locus of systematic truths. For the knowledge formulated by the teacher, it was the locus of free experiment. In August 1791, the universities were closed down. In September, the Legislative Assembly was dissolved. The ambiguity of these complex structures was about to end. The Girondists demanded total freedom, and they were supported by all those who had benefited from the old state of affairs and who, in the absence of any organization, thought they might get back, if not their privileges, at least their influence. Catholics like Durand Millane, former Oratorian fathers like Donu or Sieyès, moderates like Foucault were all advocates of extreme liberalism in teaching arts and sciences. For them, Condorcet's project threatened to reconstitute a formidable corporation. There would be a rebirth of what had only recently been abolished. The Gothic universities and aristocratic academies. It would not be long before a priestly caste would be formed that would be more powerful perhaps than that which the people's reason had just overthrown. Instead of this corporate body, individual initiative would carry truth wherever it would be truly free. Render to genius all the latitude of power and liberty that it demands. Proclaim its inalienable rights. Shower public honors and rewards on all useful interpreters of nature, wherever they may be found. Do not confine in a narrow circle those intellects that seek only to cast their light afar. No organization just as accorded liberty those citizens skilled in letters and in the arts are invited to take up teaching throughout the French Republic. No examinations and no qualifications other than age, experience, and the respect of the citizens. Whoever wished to teach mathematics, the fine arts, or medicine had only to obtain from his municipality a certificate of integrity and good citizenship. If need be, and if he deserved it, he might also get the local authorities to lend him the materials needed for teaching or experimentation. These lessons, freely given, would be paid for by the pupils by arrangement with the master. But for deserving cases, the municipality might also give grants. In this regime of economic liberalism and competition, education returned, in a sense, to the freedom of the ancient Greeks. Knowledge is spontaneously transmitted by the Word, with a capital W, and the Word that contains most truth prevails. And as if to give a note of nostalgia and inaccessibility to his dream, to lend it a still more Greek stamp that would place his intentions above reproach, the better to conceal his real aims, Foucault proposed that after 25 years of teaching, the master should, like so many Socrates recognized at last by a better Athens, be housed and fed throughout their long old age. Paradoxically, it was the mountain and those closest to Robespierre who defended ideas similar to Condorcet's project. Le Pelletier, whose plan after its author's assassination was taken over first by Robespierre, then by Rome, once the Girondists had fallen, who proposed a centralized system of education that would be controlled at every level by the state. Even within the mountain, there was concern about these 40,000 Bastilles in which it was proposed to imprison the next generation. Bouquier, a member of the Comité d'Instruction Publique, supported by the Jacobins, proposed a compromise plan that was less archaic than that of the Girondists and less rigid than that of Le Pelletier in Rome. he made an important distinction between knowledge that was indispensable to the citizen, without which he could not become a free man. The state owes him his instruction, as it owes him liberty itself, and knowledge necessary to society, which the state is under an obligation to encourage, but which it can neither organize nor control as it can the former. Such knowledge serves the collectivity. It does not form the individual. Medicine belongs with the arts and sciences. In 9 of the country's cities, schools of health would be set up, each with 7 teachers. Paris would have 14 such teachers. Furthermore, an officer of health would give lessons in the hospitals, reserved for women, children, the insane, and those suffering from venereal diseases. These teachers would be paid by the state 3,500 francs per annum, and selected by juries drawn from the administrators of the district, together with the citizens. Thus, the public consciousness would find in this system of teaching both its free expression and the utility that it seeks. With Thermidor, the hospital funds were nationalized, the corporations proscribed, societies and academies abolished, and the university, together with its faculties and schools of medicine, ceased to exist. But the convention did not have time to implement the policy of assistance that they had accepted in principle, or to lay down limits for the free practice of medicine, or to define what qualifications were necessary to it, or to decide on the form that its teaching should take. Such difficulties are surprising, since for decades each of these questions had been thoroughly discussed, and the wide range of solutions offered certainly revealed a conceptual mastery of the problems. And above all, since the Legislative Assembly had laid down in principle what, from Thermidor to the Consulate, was to be rediscovered as the solution. Throughout this whole period, an indispensable structure was lacking. A structure that might have given unity to a form of experience already defined by individual observation, the examination of cases, the everyday practice of diseases, and a form of teaching that everyone knew ought really to be given in the hospital rather than in the faculty, and in the whole course of the concrete world of disease. One did not know what one did not know was how to express in words what one knew to be given only to the gaze. The visible was neither dicible nor dicible. Dicible nor dicible. The visible was neither dicible nor dicible. This was because, despite the great changes that had come about in the theories of medicine in the last 50 years, And despite the large number of new observations, the subject of medicine remained the same. The position of knowing and perceiving the subject remained the same. And concepts were formed according to the same rules, or rather, medical knowledge as a whole obeyed two types of regularity. The first was that of individual, concrete perceptions mapped out in accordance with the nosological table of morbid species. The second, that of the continuous overall quantitative registration of a medicine of climates and places. The entire pedagogical and technical reorganization of medicine faltered on account of a central lacuna: the absence of a new coherent unitary model for the formation of medical objects, perceptions, and concepts. The political and scientific unity of the medical institution implied, for its realization, this mutation in depth. But for the reformers of the French Revolution, this unity was effectuated only in the form of theoretical themes that reorganized, after the event, already constituted elements of knowledge. These fluctuating themes certainly demanded a unity of knowledge and of medical practice. They indicated an ideal place for it, but they were also the principal obstacle to its realization. The idea of a transparent, undivided domain, exposed from top to bottom to a gaze armed nonetheless with its privileges and qualifications, dissipated its own difficulties in the powers accorded to liberty. In liberty, disease was to formulate of itself an unchanging truth, offered undisturbed to the doctor's gaze, and society, medically invested, instructed, and supervised, would by that very fact free itself from disease. The great myth of the free gaze, which in its fidelity to discovery receives the virtue to destroy. A purified, purifying gaze, which, freed from darkness, dissipates darkness. The cosmological values implicit in the Aufklärung are still at work here. The medical gaze, whose powers were beginning to be recognized, had not yet been given its technological structure in the clinical organization. It was only one segment of the dialectic of the Lumieres transported into the doctor's eyes. For reasons that are bound up with the history of modern man, the clinic was to remain, in the opinion of most thinkers, more closely related to the themes of light and liberty, which, in fact, had evaded it, than to the discursive structure in which, in fact, it originated. It is often thought that the clinic originated in that free garden where, by common consent, doctor and patient met, where observation took place, innocent of theories, by the unaided brightness of the gaze, where, from master to disciple, experience was transmitted beneath the level of words, and to the advantage of a historical view that relates the fecundity of the clinic to a scientific, political, and economic liberalism. One forgets that for years it was the ideological theme that prevented the organization of clinical medicine. That's the end of chapter 3 of The Birth of the Clinic by Michel Foucault.